My name is Celeste N. I was at BYU from 2006 to 2008. I was contemplating studying nursing, something to do with the medical field, and after 2008 I transferred from BYU. Like I said, I come from a small town, and Mormons in my town were kind of known as the kind of oddballs, and I didn't feel comfortable with being my entire self at school. And so when I was still in high school, I went to the program called SOAR for multicultural students, and I think it was that environment that made me want to go to BYU. It was that all these other kids with similar backgrounds with me, when we all came together, it was just this really good energy, and I think I wanted to find that kind of space and recreate that. So I looked for it at BYU, wanting to go there. I wanted to make my mom proud, and I feel like that was a way to do it. So really, when it came down to it, BYU was the only school that I applied to, and I happened to get in. The first year was really good. Like, I was trying to get out of my shell as just being like a shy, quiet person. I really enjoyed the classes that I took there, the things that I learned. I'm big on learning, and I loved the environment that it gave me for learning. But other than being in those learning spaces, I didn't really find spaces for me to fit in, and I was trying desperately to find somewhere where I could fit in. While I was at BYU, it was still, I really couldn't come to terms with the fact that this could be a possibility, that I might be LGBT+, and I didn't want to deal with it at the time, so it got pushed back a lot. So my mental health in that state, like, I feel like I would have been better off by going to therapy, starting therapy back then, but I pushed it off so much because I told myself that it didn't really matter that much, but when it came down to it, it did. And I think even though I'm in a really healthy mental state now, like, I feel like I'm putting that part of myself in the front and working on that for myself. There was a lot of factors that went into it, one of which was that at the time other schools had a little bit better nursing programs, but another one was BYU gave me a space to hold my Mormon identity, but I didn't have a space to hold my queer identity. I think the biggest thing is that when I was a student at BYU, I didn't feel like it was okay to be lesbian. I fell in love with my best friend. We fell in love with each other, and neither of us knew how to navigate that. And we tried really hard for a long time to just be friends, and it didn't work. And we eventually decided to get in a relationship, and we're now married, and we've been married for, we just celebrated our 5th anniversary. I think it was just the fact that we clicked so well together. We were like instant best friends, and both of us wanted more than friendship, but we didn't know how to handle that. And it was a lot of back and forth, and it wasn't until probably, 3 or 4 years after leaving BYU that I finally accepted my queer identity. And I guess that I was comfortable with who I was, but not necessarily comfortable being out. So I was in the closet for a really long time, even after I left BYU. A part of that might be because I was still living in Utah. We eventually got to a point where we needed to find a place to be ourselves outside of our house. We were just so, we would put on these masks as soon as we left our house. And it was hard to figure that part out. When I was finally comfortable with being out to people, that was a really long process in itself. It was people that I felt like I needed to be out to at first, and then slowly it became people who I knew would accept who I was regardless. And now I feel so comfortable with being a lesbian that I'm okay saying it to someone at the grocery store, just like sliding into conversation, oh, me and my wife, or anything like that, just to let people know we're out there and we exist, and we don't need to be ashamed of ourselves. I think I was ashamed of myself for a long time, and now I'm at a point where I'm not, and it feels so much better. Life is so much better. It was a little bit of a rough time because it was during the time where I was just understanding my queer identity, and it took me a long time to be okay with that. So the time just after leaving BYU, it was a little bit rough in the sense of I kind of stopped going to church at that point. I lost a little bit of sense of community in that way. But after, living life and figuring things out, I'm at a much better place in life now. I grew up in the LDS church, and that was one of the reasons why I made the decision to go to BYU initially, because I grew up in a really small town. There weren't very many of us who were LDS, and I was ready to explore that space that I could be my Mormon identity. I identified as Mormon for even a few years after I left BYU, and then I kind of went through this faith transition, and I didn't know how to reconcile these two worlds that I was trying to juggle or balance, these two different worlds, and it finally got to a point where it was just too much for me, and I decided it was healthier for me to go with my queer identity. And now I would say that I'm more of a spiritual person than a religious person. I think the biggest thing that I would have wanted to hear from someone is that you matter. You might not think you do. And I think that as you go through life, you get to a point where you just have to accept yourself, and you just love yourself. And if you're not at that point yet, you can get there. And along the way, you'll find people who love and accept you, and that your mental health matters, and it's okay to go to therapy. It's okay to talk to someone. It's okay to not be sure about how to navigate this, because there's so many of us who didn't know how, and we've gotten through it somehow.